Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our iPolitics No Talking Points Unfiltered. Today, I'm excited to bring a special guest, Mr. David Valentin, Principal at Liaison Strategies. David, welcome. It's great to have you here. Thank you for the work that you've done.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe talk a little bit about the relationship and partnership with Compass Media that we're here to kind of unveil the first pieces of today.
Yeah, it's an exciting partnership. And I think one thing that sometimes gets overlooked, we have a lot of federal polling that's done. We have a lot of provincial polling that's done. But what about municipal polling? And what about, the Ottawa election that's coming up this year? I think it makes things more exciting, but I think also when readers have the ability to know what's going on, it really helps to inform themselves and make politics at the municipal level a little more interesting, a little more accessible as well. So I'm very excited we're entering into this partnership where we'll have a monthly tracking survey for Ottawa. We can keep track of the issues and also keep track of the horse race and see how this election is going to turn out.
Now, this is exclusive with Compass Media. So if you want to see the monthly polling from Liaison Strategies and Compass, subscribe to Compass or tune in here to our podcast where David's going to tell us all about the results and what's going on. I love your idea of doing it in Ottawa. Everybody always does Toronto and the Toronto races, but we've got some pretty exciting things happening here in Ottawa, and I think it's great to be able to educate our viewers on what's happening here. So thank you for doing that. Now, I have to say, when we first started talking about this, I did some research on you, and I'm absolutely blown away. I'm absolutely blown away that you guys consistently rate in the top 2, if not number 1 in Canada in polling. Like your projections on the April 2025 federal election, you got the Liberal Party of Canada within 0.7%. You got the Conservatives within 0.3%. Ontario election in 2025, I think you guys were first or second.
First, yeah, which is always good.
So, I mean, this is amazing. We're happy to have you and your team focusing in here with Compass. Let's get into it. It's my understanding that you guys have run your first kind of base sample here in Ottawa. First of all, how did you approach it? What was your kind of don't go too deep into it, but like, how many people did you talk to? What kind of methodology are you using, and what are you seeing?
Well, our approach is always to look at how are we going to find the relevant data, and what should we ask now that we're going to need in the future? And so one of the very first things that you and I talked about was, what questions do we want to track month after month after month? And we knew right away, yes, okay, we want to know who people are voting for. That's important. But what about the direction of city? What about the top issue? Because you and I have thoughts about where that might end up by the time you get to October. But it's another thing to track it now and see that change over time. So we began to look at what are the questions we're going to ask. And then, of course, maybe other people disagree, but I just love staring at the census. I really do. And looking at census tracts and looking at past election results and looking at turnout data. So we began to put together that frame of what are the numbers that are going to power the report? How are we going to make sure we're getting that representative sample and making little adjustments, nips and tucks here and there to make sure that it all balances out correctly? I really think it's always best when you let the data speak and you try to get out of the way as much as possible. I don't want to weigh by an extreme amount. So we do a lot of different questionnaires that are really front-loaded with the demographic questions so that we can make sure we're talking to the right audience, rather than having a poll of 1,000 people, and that's how many are in the survey, 1,000 people. And then, having 80% of it be seniors. And then, it's great to talk to 800 seniors, but I want to talk to a wide variety of people in the city from all different quadrants. And speaking of quadrants, one of the things we did was we looked at voting patterns, we looked at turnout rates, we looked at geography we could explain to folks over the phone, and we realized, okay, the best way to make sure we're getting a representative sample, let's have 4 regions for the survey: Central Ottawa, South, East, and West. And let's make sure we're doing our survey bilingually, because it's the nation's capital after all. And let's make sure this is done in English and French. So those are the building blocks of the survey. Our work in elections, a lot of it is through the phone, in this case, interactive voice recording known as IVR. And I think what's really strong about this one in particular is we're going to have that trend line by the time we hit month 3. And I always say to people, the trend is more important than any individual snapshot, because there's always room for error. And there's Once you're doing things with an element of randomness, right? Statistically, there's, outlier surveys. We know all about them. Sometimes you have subsamples that are outliers. Sometimes your whole survey is an outlier. That's okay. If you're doing a series over time, you're going to see where the real trends are. And that's what's powerful about the data.
So what you're saying is that not only will you be able to pick up trends, but by having larger and larger, your sample size will continue to grow. It should become more and more accurate.
It will, yeah, because we're going to be able to look at, the way different subgroups are behaving from month to month to month.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have a better understanding of where things are going. And, we did a lot of testing in anticipation for this survey. There's work we do federally and provincially that includes serving parts of Ottawa, of course, because Ottawa is part of those surveys. So we already have some metrics that we're comfortable with in terms of response rates and all these different things that you look at, the metadata, as I call it. One question we get a lot, I want to make sure I talk about this right away, is this idea pollsters only call home phones. This is crazy. I don't know any pollster in Canada. Maybe there is one or two, but we're all calling a mix of cell phones and landlines. We're not, none of this home phone only nonsense. So I do want to let people know that that cell phones were certainly part of the sample.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what are some of the challenges you have when polling a city like Ottawa?
Well, one challenge we're always going to have, no matter what, is number portability. And, I have a 514 number, but I live in Toronto. And full disclosure, I used to live in Ottawa too. I was in the market and I was in the glebe. So I had a very nice time while I was here. But that because I have that 514, I'm not going to be eligible to take a survey in Ottawa. Just the way that RDD, random digit dialing works and the way that we create our frame, very unlikely I would ever show up in an Ottawa sample, even if I moved here, right, and was here. So, that's always going to be a challenge, number portability. But, the industry as a whole is seeing declining participation rates, whether it's online surveys, whether it's telephone calls. And, from our perspective, we are using a variety of services. When you are seeing our call, it is not going to say unknown number or probable spam. It will be saying liaison poll, liaison strategy. So there are things that the industry is addressing as a whole to try to help with this issue. And I'm really happy to be part of the industry association and helping to work on some of those issues with them.
So when you're calling, people know it's actually you call.
That's right.
For this. So if you get it, make sure you.
That's right.
Much nice. This week.
It would be nice if they would answer, but it's up to them, right?
Okay. Tell me, let's dive into it. Now, one of the things I know that you looked at was a bit of a scorecard on Mayor Sutcliffe.
Yeah.
Fair to call it that. How would you present it? And what did you see? Anything jump out at you?
I think what's interesting is we looked at the approval ratings on the issues to create that scorecard. And then we looked at his approval rating overall. And I think, to give some context, we looked at the 10 largest cities in Ontario last October. 1 year out from election day, how are things going? Among those 10 mayors, Mark Sutcliffe did not do too well. He was on the lower end of things. Now, he still had a net approval rating, which is good. That's healthy. You want to see that, which means that more people approve than disapprove of the job you're doing. This time around, it's the opposite. He's lost about 5 points of approval. He's picked up disapproval. What we're seeing is a net -2 disapproval rating, which means 2% more of the city dislikes Mr. Sutcliffe than likes him, or disapproves rather than approves, I should say. And so that's not a good situation to be in as only 2 data points. We're going to want to see more. We're going to see if next month he spikes back up or if he stays where he is now or even potentially goes lower. But that's the metric of what people think of him as on the whole. And then when you look at the issues, crime, traffic, inflation, housing affordability, transit, he's doing worse on every single one of those metrics. So none of the issues are working out in his favor right now. And I think I was quite surprised to see this. It's not surprising to me that he's doing worse on transit, and the numbers for transit are pretty abysmal. You guys are going to see that graph and you're going to be like, what is going on? But if you live in Ottawa, you already know about all the issues with the LRT. For me, one of my first experiences in Ottawa was the bus strike. And God, oh God, was that a nightmare for a lot of folks. And we all know what happened to that incumbent, right? So this is an issue that can be quite powerful. I think the mayor can talk about the fact this is something he inherited. This is not something he caused into creation. This is not, something he put in motion. But that being said, he's the mayor and people are expecting he's going to clean this up.
Does it surprise you? I mean, when I looked at the numbers that you talk about, I mean, when you think of transit and you think of the LRT and the debacle, I think it's fair to say that it has been. I think a lot of people would think, well, that's the former council, that's the former mayor, reason he didn't run for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Does it surprise you to see those numbers? Like, I think we talked about it, with 71% disapproval rating. I mean, and how hard is that to turn?
I don't think he could turn around disapproval on the issue unless he has a magic wand that can suddenly make the LRT start doing a hell of a lot better. And if he has it, he should waive it, right? Voters are tricky. I think it's not just a question of who's to blame overall. I think the question is, what is he doing to try to make this problem better? What is he doing in terms of funding transit that they see or have, viewed some sort of progress on this file? I think if you look at the public comments that he's made, it's not clear to me what actions he's taking to make this better. Blaming the last guy only works for so long. He's going to have been mayor for 4 years, and it's not like these issues just started popping up yesterday, right? So there's a lot of questions as to what is going on in this process. I think when you look at the comparison people are making, keep in mind, a lot of our provincial news always has Toronto content. They got some news about the Finch West LRT being a disaster, which it was, and it still is. But then, the Toronto story has been now the crosstown. And that's worked out perfectly well so far. And let's wait for winter to come until we have our final verdict. But if you're looking at what the mayor in Toronto is doing as a facet of the fact that you're getting the Toronto news here in Ottawa, right, on your CTV, on your global news, they're reducing the cost of monthly transit. Yeah. They are capping how much you're spending per month. They are doing all of these different projects. Canadians import a lot of American news, which means you probably might know or might have heard of some people in this city about the fact that the mayor of New York City wants those free buses, and that's what he's pushing for. So you're not looking at, Mark Sutcliffe in a silo. You're comparing him to all the other news you're receiving. He's always going to have that comparison with Toronto because so much of national and provincial news is, and love it or hate it, Toronto news. And the media that we consume,
spoken like a Toronto.
Listen, it's funny to me when I'm seeing, we did a survey on transit in Toronto, and I'm seeing they're broadcasting it out in Winnipeg, and I'm going, what is happening? But that's the news that we see on CTV News Channel, on the City News All Day channel, and it's like, this is kind of crazy. Why would people in Calgary care about what's happening to this Toronto LRT? But the media we consume is how we get informed, and for a lot of voters, it's going to include international news from TikTok, right? What's on your For You page, and all sorts of other news metrics that are going to come across social media.
Do you find when you're polling transit in other cities, for example, is it similar? Is transit a loser usually for incumbents, or is this a kind of a special case in Ottawa because of how bad it's been?
This is a special case. I mean, we've seen much stronger ratings for Olivia Chow on transit. And over there, there have been problems, don't get me wrong, but if you're a user, there have been improvements. They've gone and changed the policies and changed the agreement so that more of the subway now has cell phone service. For a lot of people, if they're going to be stuck on the subway, and they can't reach anyone and they can't watch their funny videos, hey, that's really unpleasant and unfortunate. And they're going to have thoughts and feelings about it. Oh, I can't believe I'm getting to St. Clair Station because now I'm going to lose service. But now that's changed. That's something people really notice, right? Yeah. The underground portion of the Eglinton Crosstown is so fast, and people are, very happy with it so far. They've suffered for God knows how many years, 16 years to get there to this place. There was a challenge, and then there was a solution. And then there's promises that things are going to get better. I think one interesting question is, when do people expect this LRT to get fixed? And maybe we'll ask about this in the next survey. But I think for a lot of people, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And so there is that sense of hopelessness on this issue. It's not a surprise to me he's doing the worst on this. I think what's more surprising to me is even things that you might think would be winners for him, housing affordability, crime, which is where he's doing best, they're all still losers.
Talk about crime. Crime is his best in your poll. Crime is definitely his best issue on a positive negative, but he's still in the negative. What does this tell you? What is 44, 48 Is this still a big loser?
It's not as much of a loser. This is we're almost at margin of error territory. I should mention the margin of error, when you're thinking along about these numbers, it's plus or minus 3. So you could make the argument, 48, 44, he's at -4, or maybe it's actually a -1, or he's even Steven. You can sort of contort yourself to figure out a positive way to spin these numbers, but why bother, quite frankly? There's a little bit of randomness and variability in the sample, but crime should be a much stronger issue. I really am surprised that it's going this badly for him. Most residents always have a view of crime being worse than it actually is. Doesn't matter what the statistics are. It doesn't matter if homicides are down or anything of the sort. People have this idea, mainly again because of media consumption. And we've seen this in study after study. People always think it's going up, no matter what's happening. I think, Ottawa being Ottawa, there's a lot of politicians right now talking about the fact that bail is broken, talking about the fact that, there's IRGC militants everywhere we go. And some of these are real issues because there are lots of stories about the bail system not working and people getting out reoffending. And yeah, there are people here from international places that want to do us harm. But, that's one side of the equation. On the other side of the equation, I don't know that our politicians talk about this a lot. We've got men and women in the RCMP and CSIS that are doing their damnedest to keep us safe, right? So that's the other side of the coin. And you've got the Ottawa police, love them or hate them, what happened during the shutdown, but, it was, and the convoy, but really, I know that most of them are doing their best to keep us safe each and every single day, right? But it can feel really disorienting when you're seeing on your feed, right? Incident after incident after incident. Sometimes it's old incidents that you're seeing on TikTok that just, come back into your feed. So that media diet really does dictate a lot for voters at this point. And it's really interesting because less and less of it is coming from mainstream media.
Well, and how much of it, and maybe you don't know this off your first survey, but how much of it links into one of your other topics, like homelessness? Like, it does seem like that can be a visible to the suburban mom driving through the market or downtown and seeing tents up on the streets or not being able to walk through certain walkways because of the homelessness issue. How much of that kind of correlates into the same kind of general response?
That's a great question. And the answer is, it has a really big impact when you see the encampments, when you see graffiti, when you see broken windows, when you see different signs of bad behavior. If you're in a liquor store and you see a guy run in and grab and go, that's going to have an impact on the rest of your day, right? And how safe and how secure you feel. When your neighbor has a break and enter, that's going to stick with you for a while. Again, I would say probably the police chief would say, hey, that break and enter, there are less break and enters this year than last year. But that is cold comfort for the person who actually had to suffer through it, right? And it's cold comfort for you if you're the one who saw your neighbor go through that process and who's thinking, maybe I'm next, right? So that emotional response is valid, I think. And I know there's a lot of people in criminology who want to explain the statistics, and the statistics are all fine and good. Don't get me wrong. I think they're really important, but we're human. We're going to have human reactions, right? So, for me, it's intertwined. And I think, even when I was going down the canal yesterday, out walking a dog, there's encampments. And I don't remember that being the case when I was a student here in Ottawa or when I was living here in Ottawa, right? These are all new things, and people do remember there was a time we didn't have any of this.
Now, how much of this is similar to what you're seeing in other cities, and how much of this is, you would say, very specific to Ottawa?
I think there's definitely, as we look at, we had that great survey in October, I'll keep coming back to. That survey had a whole component on crime questions. And one thing we wanted to look at was you ask people, is crime going up? Okay, well, yes, is the answer you're always going to get. But I said, what about types of crime? Because crime could mean a lot of things. For some people, crime could mean encampments, graffiti. So we asked about homicides. We asked about break and enters. We asked about auto theft. We asked about assaults. We asked about cybercrime. And we wanted to see, will there be any difference? Will some people think homicides are going up, but cybercrime is going down? Right? Great question. Sure. Yeah, exactly. Just how are people reacting to the different types of crime? Well, the answer we got back was no difference, basically. And city after city after city, some cities crime was up. Most cities crime was down. No matter who you polled, everybody was telling you crime was up. Homicides up, assaults up, everything up, up, up. So we learned a very valuable lesson, which is people do not really differentiate. And if they do, they still think it's increasing. So that is a tough environment for politicians to be in, right? And it makes, funding conversations around policing services really difficult to have, because what do you do when the police are eating up a large part of your budget and crime is actually going down? There's still going to be people who want you to hire those additional officers because they perceive crime is going up.
That's a great point. You're right. It is something that you would on TikTok or whatever you pick up. It's going to show you the worst of the worst, right?
That's right.
No matter what happens, your perception is probably altered by a relatively small sample size.
Yeah, and there's no victory ceremonies for the plane that lands on time, right? and there's never any awards given to the baggage handlers when your luggage is actually out. When you were told it was going to be some of these things, they can be very positive. No one really registers it so much.
Absolutely. Let's move on to you did a specific group of questions around Lansdowne.
Oh, yeah.
I felt was really interesting. I mean, I was actually surprised by the results that I saw out of it. If
Really?
I'm honest with you, I just thought maybe it was just the circle eyes around in a geographic area.
Yeah.
To me, it stands to reason that the people that live the furthest away from the affected facility and upgrades is going to not want to pay their taxes or going to something they're not going to see or use as often, right? But what we saw were not only the results were fairly overwhelmingly negative, but I found it interesting that in all 4 regions that you sampled, the results were very similar. Can you talk to that and about the results themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think. First of all, let me disclose, I used to live across the street from Lansdowne Park. I was there before it was built. I was there after it was built. I went through the construction. And then once it was up and running, we had a parking space at the house. And every single time there was some event or some game, did someone try to park into our parking space. So we got the tow truck number, it was in my top 10 favorites.
So you got my car towed.
No, I don't know if it was your car, but definitely someone's. That being said, proximity is not always a good indicator of support, especially with a project like this, where you're asking people to sign up for a lot of construction, right? People who went through that process the first time, if I were living across the street, again, I don't live there now, I live in Toronto, and someone was proposing to impose even more construction and noise right across from me, I wouldn't be happy about that. So you're going to have those people who like what's there now, and a lot of people like what's there now, and they should. They spent a lot of money building the first Lansdowne Park, right? And we were all pretty happy, at least I was, when they did the ribbon cutting on the first one. And now you're telling them it's not good enough, so we're going to make all these changes and do all these different things. And some people argue it's for the better. A lot of people are telling us, including these poll numbers, it's all for the worse. Definitely, some people do not want their tax dollars going outside of their area, right? They want to see improvements back at home. The question is it an improvement? And this is where I think we're seeing a lot of debate. This is where I think we're seeing Ottawa residents are telling us it's definitely not, and they don't think it's required. And so why are you spending all this money on something we don't need for something we are already okay with? But for people in the center, central Ottawa, especially the ones that are in close proximity to them, this is just another nightmare of construction. And for what? From their perspective, right?
Yeah, when I'm just calling it up here, when you look at whether it's about the price of it, the need to it, you asked the question of whether the Civic Center itself needed to be replaced. You're talking 70 to 60% disapproval. So former politician, if I seen those numbers, there's no way I'm moving forward to something in an election.
Yeah, and this is part of the challenge for the mayor is that, on these issues, he's drowning. On Lansdowne Park, which, there's been a lot of debate about, a lot of different voices being raised, and especially in terms of equity for the hockey teams and the number of seats they need to be viable. And these people, there's a lot of sympathy for groups like the PWHL and a lot of people who would tell you we need to make life easier for them, not worse, right? We need to grow the game, have more women playing hockey, not less. And all of a sudden you have a very sympathetic critic coming out against her plan.
The most successful one right now, right?
Yeah.
They're filling that place. on weekends. Like, it is such an electric atmosphere. I don't know if you've been to a Charge game. It's awesome. Take your kids, your daughters. Like, it is a really cool environment. And I was shocked to see, but it's a different environment. So they played at the CTC
Yeah.
for the weekend, and it's just a totally different environment. Playing in a much bigger building, you can't fill it. Like,
Yeah. Well, I think for a lot of people, it boils down, why are we being asked to pay more for less?
yeah.
And that is a hard road to till. And before I forget, I do want to talk about the overall mayoral numbers as well that we found in terms of voting intentions, because I think it's helpful.
We'll get
Okay.
we'll get there in a second. You're ahead of me as always on this stuff, but we'll get there now. Like, to me, one of the things that surprised me about looking at your surveys, your polling, is how the mayor and presumably the council is underwater on so many of, if not all of these issues.
Yeah.
Lansdowne seeming to be particularly across the board. Like, geographically, there was certain areas where it looked like they may be slightly worse, slightly better, but still underwater.
Yeah.
Does this create an opportunity for candidates that are in the race, coming in the race? Like, what do you see? I mean, you're a pollster. You've watched campaigns for a long time, very in depth. Is this fertile grounds, or is this opportunity for Mark Sutcliffe to kind of pick up his socks?
The most important number in this survey to me is the undecided rate. And when we looked at, a potential Ottawa race in October, the undecided rate was 20%. And that was in line with most of the other cities we looked at. Now, instead of just for context, the closer you get to election day, the lower the undecided rate is supposed to be. So if it was 20% now, or 25%, or 15%, I'd say, fantastic, we're right on schedule. Instead, it is 48%, which means 1 in 2 voters is saying, we don't know how we're going to vote. That is a really tough place for an incumbent to be. And it doesn't mean that these voters are out of reach and they've said we're not voting for Mark Sutcliffe, but you have to figure a large segment of them are very unlikely to, at this point anyway, because they're telling us how upset they are with him on crime, on inflation, on traffic, on transit, on Lansdowne. So if you look at the Venn diagrams and you look at the crosstabs of the survey, most people who like what he's doing are voting for him. But okay, we've covered that the majority of plurality in the city, 47%, don't like the job he's doing as mayor. So that's the bad news for Mark Sutcliffe. The good news, because there is some, is that he's still ahead. And that's good news. He's ahead in relative terms. He's ahead in absolute terms. He's got 2 opponents, and they still have not been able to convince Ottawa voters that they are the right choice. Now, do they have a massive opening too? Yeah, they do. That doesn't mean that they're naturally going to show people they would do better on any of these issues. In fact, they could very easily go ahead and convince everyone that they would do worse. Mark Sutcliffe is not campaigning against the most popular mayoral candidate in history. He's campaigning against a guy who I think it's fair to say is pretty unknown in terms of Alex Lawson. And he's campaigning against a city councilor who comes with his own record and his own issues, Jeff Leiper, who some people will like and some people won't. Now, Mr. Leiper is doing better in downtown Ottawa and central Ottawa. Maybe not a surprise, but we know that the voter turnout is really a lot higher in West Ottawa, is really a lot higher in more rural pockets of Ottawa, right? In these other regions. And so even though he's doing pretty well in central, we can sort of see he's still not doing enough to overtake Mr. Sutcliffe. So I would say there's a lot of room to grow. And if the mayor is able to show tangible progress on some of these issues and, sand down some of these negatives, then fantastic. He'll be in a good place for the election. And I think we'll see and track his voting intentions going up. But if not, then he's creating an opening, this massive 48% bucket of voters who could go in any direction. And, if they're not convinced about any of them, you might just see them not show up at all.
Now, does this leave an opportunity for somebody? I mean, August 21st is the cutoff date for candidates to file their papers. I would tend to agree with you. This isn't the most well-known field at this point in time, but I think the biggest fear of any candidate taking on an incumbent is having an overcrowded field.
Yeah.
And it certainly isn't that at this point in time. So does this leave an opportunity for somebody else, or do you feel like this is more an opportunity for those in the race to start solidifying on a couple of these issues?
No, I think if you're not in the race and you're thinking to yourself, I could get the money because these races are expensive. You have to be able to do some fundraising. I have a vision and you think you can communicate it well. I would look at this poll report and I would say there is the opportunity to do it. right? And now who it could be, I'm not going to speculate. I don't know of anyone who wants to enter the race, but there's an opening for sure in a way that does not exist in Toronto, in a way that it does not exist in other parts of Ontario. You look at what's happening in Hamilton, where the mayor is underwater, but her opponent is very clearly in the lead, Keenan Loomis, who ran against Andrea Horwath last time. That's a very different situation than we have here, where one of the challengers is ahead. But that being said, the math and the undercurrent is there for someone who wants to step in, especially if they want to talk about some of these issues where people think the mayor is not performing well at all, right? But the question is going to be, what solutions do they have to the problem? Because you're upset about the LRT, you don't like what the mayor's doing, okay, but is there a credible plan from the others they're going to do any better? Because just blaming Sutcliffe is not going to be enough. Just blaming the past administrations is not going to be enough, right? People want to see a solution.
Now, my question, and maybe you don't see this in the numbers yet, and something we should take a look at, but is Sutcliffe underwater on some of these issues because they don't like what he's doing, or because they don't know what he's doing, or because their perception is he's really not doing anything?
Well, I think because he's doing so much worse on the issues than he is overall, that to me would suggest some amount of knowledge, because otherwise their approval should be more or less where they are for the global number. So to me, we haven't asked people specifically, can you name things that he's done on X, Y, or Z? Now, maybe we will. One thing I always tell people is you don't know what you're going to get back until you go out and do the survey. I think you and I have talked about some ideas we had for next month. I think now that we have these numbers, we have a lot more ideas on what we might want to do and a lot of questions we might want to follow up on. But the fact that he's doing worse on every single issue does tell me he has some personal popularity. Because objectively speaking, given how badly he's doing on the issues, his approval rating should be worse.
Yeah.
Right? You've got some personal popularity and some goodwill really doing some heavy lifting here.
Name recognition.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different things that are doing some heavy lifting. You could make the argument his approval rating should be 10 points worse at this point. He should be even further underwater. That being said, that slide from over 50% to where he is now, 45%, he's lost about 5 points of approval from October, right? Now, this is a lot. Think about it, right? October, November, December, losing 1 point a month. It's not the end of the world, but if this is the way it continues and this is the long-term trend, that is not a good place to be in October.
Yeah, well, especially as an incumbent, because people have had a chance to take a look at you, right? Like I find oftentimes people's votes, their minds crystallize during the election because they're seeing the opposition candidates for the first time, whether it's federal, provincial, or municipal politics. But how much of that, like when does that start in your mind? Or like when does this become real for voters that they're in an election and they actually start taking a real hard look at?
I think to a certain extent, that's going to be up to the opposition candidates. And they're going to have to decide what the time frame is for them to put plans in front of people and how they're going to go about earning media coverage as the race continues. The registration's May 1st, so that'll be their first opportunity to make a splash because we know the media will cover the registration. Yeah. But from then, they've got to convince the media that their announcements are significant, that there should be media coverage of them. They've got to have their social media teams putting out videos and tweets and whatever you call the things on Blue Sky. And, they've got to get pamphlets out and do all this work, right? But if you have, there's a big difference between having 20 people going door to door and having 100 people go door to door. And which doors they're knocking on and how often and all the rest of it's going to influence how many people are hearing about the campaign. Ottawa's a really big place, but that's not to say you couldn't actually get a ground game created that actually is able to drive not only voter IDs, but, educate people about your platform, collect data from door to door. What are the issues that are affecting them? Maybe you mail them a letter later. There's lots of different things you can do. Social media, a lot of people are scrolling past things, but maybe you can make some advertising that breaks through. And as I always say to people, or not. And people really aren't going to tune in until September or October. And that'll be the race that we see forward. One thing I will say is, these media ecosystem that exists now is only going to get worse for the incumbent, right? It's only going to get worse because as these people register, there's going to be more attention put on them. And one would assume their critiques of the mayor. So in theory, it should only get worse. That being said, these people could go up to the microphone and embarrass themselves or say things that don't resonate. And it's also very probable, very likely, Mr. Sutcliffe and friends are going to point out to the media and point out to Ottawa residents and voters all the defects that these candidates have. So, the knife cuts both ways. Things could get worse for the mayor, or they could get better. As people sort of see the options in front of them, they could decide, you know what, we might not like this guy very much, but he's better than the rest of these people.
To ask you about, were you surprised with any of the candidates in the tracking poll, other than the mayor?
Not particularly. I mean, you're going to get a certain amount of support if you're included in a questionnaire.
Okay.
I think the big thing for me is that 48%, that undecided rate, is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Mm-hmm.
Because the undecided rate is so high, there's going to be a tendency to look at the decided numbers and say, Jeff Leiper is doing better than I thought, or, Alex Lawson is doing better than I thought. Given the context of a plus or minus 3, and the fact that the undecided rate is so high, in absolute terms, these are not great numbers. I mean, they're okay. They're a decent starting point for both, I think, but they're not particularly high. It's interesting. We could have made up a candidate. I'm sure they would have ended up with 3%, which is a margin of error, incidentally. But I don't think they're not starting from nowhere. They've got a little bit. Both of them have got Mr. Leiper significantly more so than Mr. Lawson has got more support. And you can see the one place he's really resonating so far is downtown, is central Ottawa, right? You can see he's doing a lot better there. That's actually where he's beating the mayor. Mayor's doing better everywhere else.
It's a little awkward.
Yeah.
Because he's beating the mayor in central Ottawa, and the mayor's beating him in really his own area.
For Mr. Lawson, he's got a bit of a bump in Canada, which I guess is where he's from. So maybe he's been going to community barbecues out there or shaking hands, or people just know him from the area. But more or less, they're all sort of where they need to be. And keep in mind, for these subsamples, there's a greater margin of error than 3. So good rule of thumb is just double it, double it to 6 or guesstimate it around 8. You're probably in a good place. As I mentioned, as we do the tracking, we'll have more and more confidence in some of these building blocks.
Anything else you wanted to make sure we talked about?
No, I just think it's going to be an exciting race. We hope.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to see what people decide to do. But, what's interesting for me is always just being able to look at the issues. And I think for anyone who's listening, if you have a great idea about something we should be asking about, tell us. We're not hard people to get a hold of, tweet us or write in. But I think definitely I hope people will subscribe and learn more about the polling as we continue doing it.
Well, I want to thank you, David, because democracy suffers when there isn't eyeballs on it. And you partnering with Compass Media in this endeavor, I think, is going to be good for democracy in Ottawa. I think we're going to get to see the vibrancy of the race, the issues, as we were talking about today, that are moving people in this city. And I think that's important. And I appreciate you being part of this. And anybody that wants to see the polling, please go to compassmedia.ca or Liaison Strategies, and also reach out to the Compass Media team, the iPolitics team, or David's team. And we want to make this as interactive as possible for the people of Ottawa to get their real feedback. So thank you very much.
I'm very happy to. And, we always knew the campaign teams were going to have polling. Now the voters get their own polling too. So that's democracy in action.
Absolutely. And on that point, purely independent on this one.
That's right.
Absolutely. And I think this is great. I think it's a great spot to start out, and I'm looking forward to having you every month to talk about this until it gets closer and closer, and we'll get even more polling going.
That's right. I'm looking forward to coming back.
All right. Thank you very much. It was good having you.